today we're going to be looking at Introduction to Labyrinth Typology with Yadina Clark and Jeff Saward. And both of those beautiful people are here we go. All right. First of all, just let me tell you a little bit about Yadina Clark. She's a labyrinth artist, educator, facilitator, and researcher. She serves as a board member of the Labyrinth Society and organizer of the International Discussion Group, focusing on current research in labyrinth typology. And Jeff Saward, beloved of the labyrinth community, has been recording labyrinths for over 45 years and has administered the worldwide labyrinth locator since its launch in 2004. He's a writer, educator, and historian. Jeff, thank you for being with us today. Take it away, team.
So, labyrinth typology. The description and naming of different types of labyrinths is something that's really kind of intrigued people for many, many years, and is the subject of much discussion to this very day. And while people have been writing about labyrinths since back in the mid-1800s, the first real person to describe different types of labyrinths was W.H. Matthews in 1922, essentially a century ago now, when he defined the difference between what we now call labyrinths and mazes by pointing out that labyrinths are unicursal and that mazes are multicursal, i.e. they have many paths that run from the entrance to the center. And I guess that's the one thing that we can all agree on. But the different types of labyrinths, well, that's something that's been a subject of much more discussion. And various people have tried to talk about this over the years, starting with some writers back in the 1950s and 60s. In Spain, John Heller and Stuart Cairns, for instance, did an interesting mathematical analysis of what we now call classical labyrinths. Paul de Saint-Hilaire, who published several books in French in the 1970s through to the 1990s, broke labyrinths down into different types, but more based upon where they occurred than anything to do with their actual designs. Most of these early studies were really restricted to specific types of labyrinths and were either very generalized and have now largely been outdated by modern research and developments. And in Scandinavia, of course, where there's 500 or 600 stone labyrinths that have been described and in many cases preserved, there are lots of different types of labyrinths, albeit that they're nearly all based upon what we call classical labyrinth designs. And consequently, the likes of Jan Kraft, Bosse Sternström, and several other researchers in Scandinavia have been working on a classification of those labyrinths that are occurring in Northern Europe since the late 1970s. But their work was particularly concerned with the different types of stone labyrinths. But they do notice things like, for instance, what we now call Baltic labyrinths, labyrinths that have a path that come in and then split two ways and go into a double spiral so that you can walk through the labyrinth and all the way back out again. But some of those labyrinths in Scandinavia are horribly complicated. And then there's another group, the Roman mosaic labyrinths. Now they've been studied. Victor Daszewski, Jan Kraft, and Anthony Phillips have all published papers on the Roman mosaic labyrinths, the types of designs that we now refer to as Roman. And Daszewski started that study back in the 1970s and broke Roman mosaic labyrinths down into three groups, what he called meander, serpentine, and spiral. And if you look at the designs, you can kind of see here on the left-hand side, those ones are meandering through each quadrant before they go to the center. In the middle serpentine group, they weave in and out, and then on to the next quadrant. And for the spirals, they spiral through each quadrant. Jan Kraft then broke those down into some subcategories. And Anthony Phillips's papers in 1988 and 1992 were based entirely upon the mathematical structure of those labyrinths. And he actually managed to find 25 distinct topological types from the 46 well-preserved mosaics that were part of his study. Clearly, lots of different design types and different styles. Herman Kern then became, in his book Labyrinth, which was republished in 2000 as Through the Labyrinth in the English language, was the first person to really attempt to break down a wide gamut of different types of labyrinths. And he called what we now call classicals Cretans in various different forms. And then he also looked at the Otfrid labyrinths that are a development from the classical Cretan types. And he also looked at the medieval labyrinths and broke them down into Chartres, Reims, St. Omer, and various other types based upon their design structures. And then in 1991, a group of us were meeting at a conference at Saffron Walden here in England. Myself, Sig Lonergan, Alex Champion, Adrian Fisher, Lindsay Hayes, Bosa Sternstrom. And this was the Year of the Maze, a big event here in England. And we all got together in a pub one morning over breakfast after the conference and argued out what different types of labyrinths should be called. And basically, the one thing we could all agree on was that the way that classical labyrinths are created was from a seed pattern. And that, as far as I'm aware, is the first time that that piece of terminology entered into common usage. But we discussed various other odd things about different types of labyrinths. And Sig and myself continued to work on that through the late 1990s, so that when the Labyrinth Society website was launched in 1999, and then the Labyrinth Locator website in 2004, we basically come up with 4 different types of labyrinths based on their historic and geographic occurrences. Classicals on the left, Romans, medievals, and this new group of labyrinths, which back in 1991, there were a few of them around, particularly some strange things that Alex Champion had been building out in California, which we referred to as contemporary labyrinths. They didn't look much like any other labyrinths we'd seen at that stage. So we kind of lumped them all together until someone could come up with some better names for them. But now is probably the time for a revision. 30 years ago, when we put those basic types down on paper, the current revival of labyrinths was just starting. We had no idea what was going to happen, how many new types of labyrinths would be developed in the coming years. And it's especially true of some of the medieval variants and figurative types of labyrinths based on shapes rather than designs. While some of those groups, like the medieval labyrinths, have had plenty of study and are continued to be studied, there's a whole group now of labyrinths that really push the boundaries, new styles, new designs. So consequently, the previous system of categorizations beginning to creep at seams somewhat. I mean, good grief, there's even a labyrinth in the shape of Snoopy's head. Over to you, Dee.
The need for improvement in these systems comes from a number of different things that we have noticed. One, simply that there are multiple systems currently out there. There are inconsistencies among the systems and within some of the systems as far as how the decisions are made to put them in different categories. We've collected a few too many other and miscellaneous types, and it's gotten a little catch-all instead of being a meaningful category. And we have new variations based on historical labyrinths, so we can't just look at it from the historical perspective. And we, of course, have all these new innovations. Some of the challenges involved in making a more comprehensive system. There are differences in terminology. different people develop their own system, their own habits, their own vocabulary, and have personal preferences. We have a lot of different languages of the different people who are interested in this type of work. And somehow we have to come to a consensus, at least, not that everyone has to use certain terms, but that we have a set of terms that everybody understands. And we are continuing the research. So there are new areas that may not have been looked at previously. So, and we want to make it accessible to a wide audience, not just those of us who really enjoy delving into the details. So sort of translating some of that background work into easily digested sound bites is a challenge as well. So classification and typology are similar terms, but I like to think of classification as the broader categories, and the typology is the work that happens at the more fine-grained detail. And the reason that we need to look at things closely is just like you have with plant names, you have the common names, which can be you know, the same name being used for multiple things, and you need the Latin term to know specifically which one you're talking about. And for us, that's the circuit sequence or the level sequence that tells us exactly how the path travels through the different circuits and sectors. A distinction that's important to make is there's a difference between type and style. All of these labyrinths on the side here look like different labyrinths, but they are all the same underlying pattern. So they're all in different styles, different designs, but they all have the same type. So a type is a specific pattern of movement, a mathematical topology that remains the same through any changes in shape, size, or style. And those types can be expressed in a lot of different ways, depending on chosen style, specific artistic designs, and sometimes intention that is attached to how a design is meant to be used. So our approach needs to be based on topological type and some other considerations like recurring component patterns and groupings, which we're not going to go into. It's too much detail for this presentation. But we've been working off of families and some commonly understood types-ish, but what we're trying to do is develop a more comprehensive system that expands outward to classes and inward into specific groups and absolutely pinpointed types. And there's a vocabulary that we're using, there's mathematical ideas that we're using, and this is all current research that's going on, and there will be Cardroya articles and a lot more coming out in the next couple of years from this work. I'll just run through these slides really quickly to give you an idea of some of the things that we're talking about. We're grouping patterns based on their shared characteristics. And so far, so good. You know, this seems to make sense and not be too far off of what we've already had. But then we get into some new things that we're trying to categorize, like serial labyrinths. They do not have just a single radius center. They have multiple orientation points. They can have multiple designs, but it's all one continuous path. This is one of Denny Dyke's creations. And maybe this is something we're considering, transverse labyrinths. So 3 of the designs up there are transverse labyrinths. And this is ones that have a path that does intersect itself, but it can be followed as one continuous path. It's not a maze, and you do cover all of the territory once. And we also have a couple of others you might recognize. The red one is Alex Champion's contemporary design that Jeff had on one of his slides. And even though it's such a contemporary, sometimes referred to as avant-garde style, that can actually be considered a sector labyrinth, similar to how the Roman labyrinths complete all movement in one sector before moving on to the next and the next and the next.
Yadina, might you be able to take a couple comments from the chat room at this point?
Yes.
We have about 5 more minutes.
There's only a couple more slides. I'll just run through them quickly. This is
Okey-doke.
just sort of some graphics that we're using to help us understand the patterns that we're looking at. You can express a labyrinth pattern in a rectangular diagram. It makes it much easier to compare patterns and look for recurring components and how they get built up into bigger labyrinths. And so we're looking for those patterns in the patterns, and it gets quite complex. So this is coming out of some email conversations, and then more recently some Zoom meetings that we're having with this international labyrinth typology research group. And if anyone has really a truly deep interest in this, maybe doing some of this work, you can contact me if you would be interested in joining this group.
Well, thank you for that, Yadina. I have been a fly on the wall at a couple of your meetings, only because I want to learn more. It is fascinating work. We do have a question from Athena Dugan. She wanted to know, if you build a contemporary labyrinth, would the beginning pattern be called a foundation, since the pattern is not stemming from a seed pattern? Would we call it a foundation?
Well, there are a lot of different kinds of seed patterns, and I would just say again, you can make a distinction between the type, which is the underlying pattern of movement, and the design and style of how that type is expressed in the actual installation.
Well, we have just a few more moments. I was wondering if you could maybe you or Jeff could just wrap up 1 or 2 more comments before we go on to the next presenter.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, so to go back to where we started, I mean, this is a discussion that started a century ago, well, 99 years ago, if we're going to be really picky. In 1922, when Matthew's book, the first real study of the subject came out. And it's an ongoing discussion that's been developed over the years and is still far from finished. Because every time you think you know what types of labyrinths there are, someone's going to come up with a new type that's really going to baffle you.
Well, thank you, Jeff and Yadina. I just want to let you know you've got a lot of comments, super precise work. Wow, can't wait to learn more. Lots of beautiful comments on this work. Thank you for your presentation this afternoon.